An hour later, we're still running. Matt was astonished at how much energy Pedro seemed to have after all he. Now I've read that. Matt was astonished at how much energy Pedro seemed to have after all he looked as if he hadn't eaten for a week. But he had to keep up the same pace ever since they had left the hotel, pausing only when a dirty blue van wore barred windows and the words Pelica Nalica painted on the side camera. Speeding past, then Pedro ducked behind what seemed to be an abandoned lorry, dragging Matt with him. He took one look at Matt and signaled for him to rest. The two of them sat on the pavement. As he regained his breath, Matt remembered what Rodriguez had told him. He had no papers. He had entered Peru illegally. At the time when the Nixers had staggered, its forget passports had sounded like a good idea, but in fact Richard had been delivered a gift wrapped into enemy hands. Matt couldn't prove who he was. There was no record of his arrival, and if he disappeared, nobody would know or care. Demos asperosus, Pedro said, and stood up again. Matt understood it was time to go. They were in a wide, busy road somewhere on the edge of Lima, standing in front of a row of shops and a restaurant, all over them missing their front windows. And the door, in fact, they had no fronts at all. They were like open boxes with the inside spilling out onto the streets. The smell of food mixing with the petrol fumes. Opposite them, a row of men in jeans and baseball caps sat slumped against a row of concrete walls, seemingly with nothing to do. There were also a couple of shoe-line boys with crude wooden boxes strapped to their backs. The slight gave Matt a jolt. They were both about 6 years old. Where are we going? Matt asked. Either Pedro didn't understand or he couldn't be bothered to answer. He was already moving along the pavement. Matt was exhausted, but he forced himself to follow. What else could he do? They come to sat off traffic lights. Pedro's face broke into a grin. It was the first time Matt had seen him smile. There was a truck waiting, carrying a load of building materials. Pedro had re, 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 ris- re, recognized the driver. He ran forward and began to gesture a couple of times in Matt's direction. The lights changed to green, and at once all the cars behind began to blast their horns, but the driver wasn't in a hurry. He waited until Pedro had finished, glanced briefly at Matt, then jerked his thumb. Pedro signaled to him, and with a huge feeling of relief, Matt climbed with him into the back. They sat off again. Matt was desperately tired. He'd only managed a few hours. of troubled sleep. The night before he was also in bed. While following his encounter with Rodriguez, there was a stick pounding in his head and his stomach, and he was sure he'd broken a rib. The police had beaten him up. How could such a thing have happened, and in a public place in the middle of a hotel? What sort of country was this? The driver shouted something out of a window, and Matt saw his hand appear, holding a small bunch of bananas. Pedro took them and broke some off, offering them to Matt. Matt shook his head. He was starving, but he couldn't bring himself. Shook his head. He was starving, but he couldn't bring himself to eat. He was in too much trouble. Too much pain. Pedro struggled, peeled a banana, and took a bite. Matt wasn't sure what to make of this boy. There was no doubt that Pedro had saved him by waiting outside the hotel with his slingshot, but it was hard to know exactly why right now he was ignored him completely. It was if Matt was nothing more than an annoyance, like a stray animal following him down the street. Certainly there was nothing very friendly about the boy. Quite the opposite. Matt had to remind himself that only a few hours before Pedro had been trying to rob him, and he was still wearing his watch. Maybe he was still interested in Matt's 10 wearing his watch. Maybe he was still interested in Matt's £10 note. No, what wasn't fair. Matt had offered him the money earlier, and Pedro had refused to take it. So where were they going now? Pedro must live somewhere in this great unwelcome city. Perhaps he had parents. Hopefully he would know somebody who could help. About 20 minutes later, the truck stopped and the two of them climbed out, Pedro waving and shouted at the driver. Matt found himself standing at the foot of a hill where an ugly township, a triangle of bricks and wires spiraled its way up the slope. He had never seen anything like it. His first impression was what this was, a community that had tumbled down the hillside, getting broken and jumbled up along the way. When he realized that it had been built like this, it was a barrio, a shanty town, home to the poorest of the poor. As ever, Pedro was already moving. Matt followed him as he plunged into a maze of narrow streets, pathways, none of them paved, all of them covered in rubbish and other debris. Only now, what he was in the middle of it all, did Matt sees that less than half the houses were built of brick. Most of them had been made of cardboard, corrugated iron, straw mats, plastic sheeting of a mixture of all four. They come to a sort of square where a group of old women in bright swirls and bowler hats squatted beside a rusty oil drum that had been turned into a makeshift oven. They were cooking some sort of stew in evaporated milk cans that they had beaten flat and made into pans. A few scurry chickens pecked hopefully at the rubble, and a dog in it. Was hard to be sure if it was alive or dead. Lay stretched out in the sun, there was a troubled smell of sewage. Matt covered his nose and mouth with his hand. He was amazed that anyone could live here, yet Pedro barely seemed to notice it. Matt was aware of the woman looking at him, because he wondered what they must think he was gubble. And subscribe it well, share, like, thank you, click comment, scream a thumbnail please, watch my videos from start to finish, subscribe it well, thank you.